Yá'át'ééh, my relatives. Hello, this is Mark Charles. It is Friday, April 22nd. I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and I decided I wanted to take some time today to try to answer some questions. So I wanted to do some Q&A today. It wasn't planned out fully in advance, and so we have a few questions coming in. But if you're joining today and you have a question about a previous topic I had on my second cup of coffee, if you have a question about my book, Unsettling Truths, if you have a question about things I've written or talked about, the doctrine of discovery or anything like that, feel free to put them in the comments section. My friend and colleague, Phil Fox, is helping me, our partner in this, is helping me to moderate this a little bit. And so he's going to be capturing your questions and getting the ones that we can answer up on screen so that we can take time to answer them today. And so I welcome you to merely just put your questions into the comment section of whatever medium you're watching this on. If you're watching on YouTube, put the question in the YouTube comments. If you're watching on Facebook, put your question in the Facebook comments, and we'll be able to capture them and hopefully get them answered. But before I begin, as I always do, let me start by acknowledging the people whose land I'm living on today. So I moved with my family from the Navajo Nation to Washington, D.C. about almost 7 years ago now. And so the lands where we live today are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the host of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of the land. And I just want to state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. I also want to just acknowledge that right now there is a very large fire burning right near the Navajo Nation. That's right outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. Some people I know actually, I think, may have lost their homes in Flagstaff. And so it's been a growing fire. There's been a lot of damage. There's been a lot of evacuations. And so our prayers are definitely with the people around the Flagstaff area whose lives are being deeply affected by this forest fire. Also want to acknowledge the devastation of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. If you haven't heard, they found several mass graves that they believe hold up to thousands of Ukraine civilians killed by Russian soldiers. And so we definitely need to keep Ukraine and the people there in our prayers and pray for peace in that region and for accountability for Vladimir Putin and for Russia. Also, just one last comment. Today is Earth Day. And so we need to, obviously, we want to be good stewards of the earth we are living in every day. But today is especially a day where we can be aware of it. And so, yeah, if you have any thoughts or tips of what you're doing to commemorate Earth Day today, what are the commitments you're making to live more sustainably, things you're doing to help our environment, please feel free to share those. Something our family did, this was a few months ago, is we've been driving for years a large SUV, a Chevy Traverse. We bought it when we lived back on the res and we needed something to get through the mud. And we were driving that and brought it with us here to DC. Of course, it's a large Traverse. It doesn't get good gas mileage. It is not practical in the city. We were probably spending, just doing our normal commuting, getting kids to school and buying groceries, we were probably spending $50 to $70 a week on gas for our Traverse. And so when it had some mechanical problems, we decided to get a hybrid. And so we got a Honda Accord Hybrid 2022 and are loving it. We love our hybrid. It gets about 45 to 50 miles to the gallon. So now we're spending $15 to $20 a week on gas, getting incredible gas mileage, filling up maybe every 10 to 15 days, almost every 2 weeks we have to fill up. And just it's actually made us even much more conscious about our driving patterns and being conscious of how much gas we're using. And so, yeah, we've been very, very happy with our hybrid. It's been a fantastic car. And so, yeah, that's one thing that we're doing. And we're just, or as a family, we're much more aware in our new car of what our gas mileage is and how we're driving and what are we doing to conserve gas. So I want to encourage people, especially today on Earth Day, not just what can you do today, but what are commitments you can make moving forward to be a better steward of this earth that we are living on, and the responsibility we have to take care of it. So let me see who's joining us today. Obviously, we got Phil Fox here. Hey, Phil, thanks for being here. Thanks for your help today. Shantina from Virginia is here. We have Lindsay is here, and Reverend SJDR is here. So I want to thank you. This is a time for some Q&A. So if you have a question regarding my content, if you have a question regarding something I've been speaking about or the topic of a second cup of coffee previously, feel free to put those into the comment section. We were going to take probably about a half an hour, 20 minutes to a half an hour to answer some questions today. We have a few that came in already. So I'm going to try to answer one of those. One of the questions that came in, if you saw how I announced this this Q&A, I showed a picture of my brewing, my coffee brewing, and I was using, of course, my AeroPress. And I do use the inverted method of the AeroPress where I have it upside down. It's a bit more risky than the normal AeroPress way because obviously you can flip it over and your coffee spills all over the counter. I've done that a couple times, but it makes a great cup of coffee. I love our AeroPress, and the beans that we had that I actually went out and bought them today are from a local coffee roaster right here in Washington D.C. known as Harar Coffee, and I bought their limu beans. And the question was, am I drinking Arabica? And yes, these are 100% Arabica beans. They're roasted in this little coffee roaster here in DC. And I've been using that coffee shop for pretty much, I've known about it almost the past 7 years that we've moved here. I think it was one of the first coffee shops I found, and it's one of my favorites here in DC. And so I will frequently go there to either just get a cup of coffee or to buy my beans and bring them back here. And so I love local coffee shops. I love coffee shops that do their own roasting, and I do my best to try and give my money to those establishments as frequently and as often as I can. A few of the questions that we were asked, and let me just bring up one right now. And this came, I'm going to put some of this into the comment section. Let me put this into the comment section. This is the question that was asked, and I think here I can highlight it now. So the question was, I go to a small church where we are actively trying to decolonize our faith. I've learned that acknowledging and honoring the original stewards of this land is critical. How else can we as a worshiping community honor and learn from our native hosts? That's a very good question. And it's not something that I would say you can just give a pat answer for, right? It's not something that you can just say, well, this is what you do and this is what happens all the time. Rather, I really encourage people to build two sets of relationships with the area where you live, whether you're a worshiping community or just someone who lives in a house somewhere here on Turtle Island. I would encourage you to build two sets of relationships. The first is to build a relationship with the native community around you, the people who are there. Most major cities will have some sort of Indian, Native American gathering of some kind, some sort of a community center or something like that, or there may be tribes around the area. And so I would begin to work intentionally to build a relationship with the Native American community who live around you. Now, especially if you live on the East Coast, that people who live around you may not be the original hosts of those lands. That tribe could have been moved out or even exterminated altogether. And so the second thing I would encourage you to do is to build a relationship, if possible, with the people whose land you're living on. So if you live in North Carolina and the tribes have been moved to Oklahoma, then work to build a relationship with the people whose land you're living on, even though they may live in Oklahoma. This could mean traveling there. This could mean learning their history. This could mean just finding some intentional way to build a relationship. And so it's out of those relationships that you can find the best way to honor those nations and those people. There's no just one pat answer of this is the best thing to do. The best thing to do, I would say, is build the relationships, and then out of those relationships, learn how and begin to grow in your understanding of how do you honor those nations, how do you honor those people, and how you're living, where you're living, and what you're doing, and how do you move forward in community instead of the way often it happens where you go and you give your charity or you do your act of whatever, and that it becomes a very one-way relationship. But if you build a relationship and have an ongoing relationship with both your local community as well as the people whose land you're living on, then you can find a way to move that forward. So I think that's a very good question. Oh, this says Reverend SJDR. That's your question. Hey, thanks for submitting that. I'm glad you asked that question. Let's see. There's actually another question, and I believe it's by the same person. The question was, how can we, how can a non-native Christian get into the circular life without just being cultural appropriation? I'm not quite sure what you mean by the circular life. I have an assumption based on some research I've done on time perception. But if you want to clarify something in the comment section now about that, I'm happy to kind of incorporate that into the answer. But let me tell you how I'm reading that question. And then if you need to clarify it or ask it a bit differently, feel free to do that. When I was in college, I began doing some research on the Navajo perception of time, and looking at how time perception affected students coming off the reservations and studying in large Western universities. And to do that research, I had to define both the Western and the linear perceptions of time. The Western time perception is very linear. It's based on a schedule, has definite starting and ending points, and you value people within that perception of time by honoring their schedule. The Navajo and many Native American time perceptions are circular. There's no definitive starting or ending point. You don't base your life on a schedule, but you base it on completing a task. And so, whereas in the linear perception of time, you want to make sure you arrive on time and you don't go over time, and that you honor the people's schedule. That's very important in the Western time perception. In the Native time perception, it's not nearly as offensive if you show up late. What is offensive is if you keep checking your watch and then cut the conversation short and leave early. And so living your life within a circular perception of time is vastly different from living your life in a linear perception of time. And even when I used to speak about this a lot. I would speak on college campuses and to church groups all around the country. And a lot of people were very intrigued by the idea of living their life with a circular perception of time. What I came to learn is while they were intrigued by that, what they were really wanting to do is if I ever have a Sunday afternoon free and there's not a good football game on, I'd love to live that way for a few hours. But we all know come Monday morning, we have to become adults and we have to live like the Western world, and we have to go back to the linear perception of time. And that's not accurate. So I would say, yeah, when especially when I lived on the reservation and I really allowed myself to live in a way that was much more circular. And so now going into every interaction, even today, living in this Western world here in Washington, D.C., because I understand both my perception of time and the time perception of the community I'm living in, And because I'm well aware that most people don't think they have a time perception, right? Most people think they have a time truth, and they assume that the way they see time is just the way time is. And Western culture assumes that they're the pinnacle of cultural evolution, and so they assume that the way they perceive time is not only the only way to perceive time, but it's the best way to perceive time. So even if they learn about other time perceptions, they will tend to look down on them because they're different and they're not the same as theirs. And so going into every interaction, I actually have come to realize I have to make a choice. Am I going to honor the time perception of the Western person I'm interacting with? Or am I going to use this interaction as a teaching moment to teach them something about the value of completing a task and not being so driven by a schedule-based linear perception of time? And so that's where it becomes challenging, is when you live in a world where everything is hyper linear and hyper scheduled, and you have to, the difference between meeting a deadline or missing it by 5 seconds is the difference between, life and death in some instances. Or they make it feel like it's life and death. Right. So how do you live with a circular perception of time in this hyper linear, hyper schedule driven environment? And what I learned about these two time perceptions, and I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong and one's good or one's bad. They're both have different strengths and weaknesses. The strength of the Western time perception is that you're very productive, right? That's a strength. A weakness of the circular time perception is it's not very productive at all. A weakness of the Western time perception is it leads to a mentality of good enough for government work, which means I met the schedule, but it's not my best work. A strength of the circular perception of time is it really allows you the space to do something with excellence. So they both have strengths, they both have weaknesses. It's not that one's good or one's bad, one's right or one's wrong. They're just different. Now, one of the things I've learned about the Western perception of time is it gives you the illusion that you're in control. And so much of why I think Western culture becomes so obsessed with time is because it gives them the illusion that they're in control. And so part of introducing a different way of looking at time isn't just about things can be a bit more relaxed, but to have that sense of relax that comes with a more circular perception of time, you actually have to give up trying to control everything. And that's where, especially for people who've grown up and lived all their lives in the Western culture, giving up that control can be terrifying and incredibly stressful. And so, again, this is where I think time perception has deep implications for how we live our lives and even the things we value and how we show those values. And so if you are a Western person trying to live within a circular perception of time, I would not necessarily say that was cultural appropriation. I would say it's developing yourself and going outside of your cultural boundaries. Now, if you use aspects of native culture and you think, well, now that I'm living this way, it gives me the right to do these other things and to appropriate native culture in some more specific ways, that's something altogether different. But just understanding a circular perception of time and living your life within that perception of time, because a circular perception of time isn't strictly Native American. In fact, in my travels around the world, I've come to learn that most indigenous peoples, or most people outside of kind of Western civilization, have much more of a circular understanding of time, of that things will come back around and you want to focus on completing tasks. That is not solely a Native American understanding, but it's actually, I think, the invention of the clock and, what happened with Western culture has actually lent itself to their becoming obsessed with a very linear perception of time. Anyway, I hope that's a helpful question to you, or a helpful answer to your question. I appreciate that comment. And let me see what else we have here. How can non-natives help natives hold perpetrators accountable for crimes they commit against natives? People don't seem to be listening or taking their land theft problems seriously. That, Lindsay, is the $24,000 question, right? That's the question. How do you get people to care about these things? I was listening to yesterday. There was an article in the New York Times about several of the major German automakers, Volkswagen, Porsche, BMW, are built on the founders of these companies worked for the Nazi regime. And that's how they got their start. And they actually used slave labor, and they built these massive companies out of the benefits that came from cooperating with the Nazi regime. And right, this New York Times article was pointing out how horrific this was, that we have these companies today that are profiting from these roots that are in Nazi Germany. And yes, that's an issue, and that's a problem, and we definitely need to think about that. I think what made it ironic is that it was being called out by someone here in the US and was making no mention of how this nation is, to this day, still living on the spoils taken from Native Americans and African Americans through enslavement and through cultural and even physical actual genocide. And so again, this is the problem, is this country is so completely unaware of what it's done and what it's built on. And again, this is why I talk about the trauma of white America, that it thinks it can call out injustices around the globe, which are unjust and need to be called out. But the fact that it's typically white Americans calling out those injustices around the globe, and they have no clue and have no acknowledgement of the injustices that they themselves are standing on and are continuing to perpetuate even today. That's the whole irony, right? That's what just makes this whole thing exasperating. And so, again, this is why I work so hard to create this common memory. This is why I work so hard to teach this history. This is why I go back again and again and again to answer questions and to have these dialogues, is because I can't necessarily make people care, right? I can't make them feel, I can't compel them to feel a certain way, or I can't compel them to even act a certain way. I can educate them. And I can at least say, well, if you're going to continue to enjoy the spoils of this injustice, I at least want you to be aware of what it is that you're standing on. So then you can make the choice of whether you want to embrace that or actually make changes. And so this is why I do my second cups of coffee. This is why I do these things, because I can't compel anyone to act a certain way. I can't make anyone believe or feel a certain way. I can educate them, and I can not allow them to perpetuate lies. I can counter their lies with the truth. And I can give them a choice of whether they want to continue to celebrate these things that are actually very harmful, or if they want to make changes and actually do something that they've never done before. And this is why this work is so hard, I think, is because our nation has gotten so good at blinding itself, at closing its eyes to what it's done and what it's standing on. And again, this is why I talk frequently about the trauma of white America. right? Because I'm actually hypothesizing or theorizing that this blindness, this denial our country lives on, is actually coming from a multi-generational and communal manifestation of a perpetration-induced traumatic stress. And so I'm dealing with people who are traumatized by the incredible violence that they are standing on, that they and their ancestors perpetrated against other people. And this is a process. This is a long process, and I'm doing my best to educate people. But I think that's the challenge: is if we really want to see these changes, we have to educate people on what it is they're standing on, and then we have to give them options of choices they can make to do something different. That was a great question. I appreciate you asking that question. There's another question here. The medicine wheel, I love it, especially now as a holistic medicine student. How would you explain that to a Christian family member? I was introduced to it from Lakota. I do not want to jump into that question right now. I love the question, but because you were introduced to it from another nation, and I haven't reviewed all of the things around the medicine wheel. I don't want to go into that right now, but I will definitely take this question and put some thought into it, and I can definitely answer that in a future Q&A. And I want to start doing these more regularly, at least once a month, if not even once every other week. But I appreciate that question. Thank you for asking that. And I just want to make sure I don't make any assumptions about another nation's medicine wheel that I'm not fully educated on or aware of. So thanks for asking that question, and I will definitely come back to it. There was one other question I wanted to get to, and I'll end with this question here. And this was actually asked on my Patreon, and I'm going to be responding to it at length there as well during my Patreon Q&A. But I'll read the question because it brings a lot of background in, and then I'll do my best to begin to answer, at least introduce some of the answer here. So the question I was given on my Patreon said, I learned from an institute on intercultural development that developmental approach is necessary to allow your audience, student, conversation partner to hear challenging information. This entails presenting information that is one stage beyond where the person is to promote their growth, but refraining from presenting information that is far beyond where they are, as doing so will create resistance and backlash. Oh, and I need to plug in my computer here a minute. Sorry about this. Let me get a plug. Hold on just a second. Sorry about that. I just got to notice my battery was going to die because I forgot to plug in my computer. Anyway, let me go back. This entails presenting information that is one stage beyond where the person is to promote growth, but refraining from presenting information that is far beyond where they are, as doing so will create resistance and backlash. Although I do not know your audiences, I feel safe in assuming that you are pushing way beyond what most of us assume we understand. At the end of your lecture on the trauma of white America, you began to talk about how you do this. I would really be more interested in hearing you talk more about this. I question this developmental approach I was taught, even while acknowledging the resistance and backlash are real. I feel dissatisfied with it because of what MLK called the fierce urgency of now, and what Stevie Wonder says, can't put it in the hands of fate, ain't nobody got time to wait. And so then the question was, and let me just get the question here. So the question is, how do you deal with this developmental approach, or do you do with this developmental approach? How do you teach so far beyond where people are, so you can make them aware of the things that you're talking about? And I love that question because, right, this is the challenge of my work. And the challenge we have, as we say in our book, right, when we present one of the hardest chapters in the book, the two chapters, which is chapters 9 and 10 about Abraham Lincoln, and trying to get people to understand that Abraham Lincoln is not only a blatant white supremacist, but one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history, right? This is a complete opposite understanding of what most Americans have of Abraham Lincoln, which is that he freed the slaves and he redeemed our nation and he brought tremendous harmony among the races. And so to shift that paradigm is like going from almost from one extreme to the other. Including making the comparison, as I do in many of my lectures, that he is actually very similar to Adolf Hitler. And so, right, you're not going to get there by just kind of going a baby steps at a time, right? You have to basically shift this. And that's the case with so much of what I present. And this is actually what helped me um, understand better this is what sent me searching for what were the blocks, and which eventually led to my understanding of what I call the trauma of white America, which is that there is a specific denial about our nation and our history, and how to then we can then teach that. And once I understood that a lot of the reaction of white evangelicals and white Americans was trauma induced, coming from a perpetration induced traumatic stress, I was then able to find ways to go far beyond where they were, and instead of taking baby steps, to kind of rip the Band-Aid off. And the things I do in my lectures, right, when I go into a lecture, I warn people, hey, I'm going to say some things that are going to make you want to stand up and walk out. I'm going to say some things that are going to actually infuriate you and make you want to even throw something at me, right? I actually tell people this. And then I say, resist those urges. Let's get through this lecture because there's some things we have to learn how to talk about. Also, in the middle of my lectures, when I lecture on the Doctrine of Discovery, my 2-hour lecture, I stop in the middle, usually after one of the most horrific points of going through the history. And I tell people, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, there's no good answer, there's no bad answer. I merely want you, in 3 words or less, to emote for me. How does this history make you feel? And then I allow people to just shout out from the audience, 3 words or less, how they feel about this history, what emotions are going on for them. I've learned that by warning people, I'm going to shock them. And by giving them an emotional outlet in the middle of the lecture, actually gives them the tools they need to make it through the lecture. I've also learned that after the lecture is over, I can't necessarily press the dialogue immediately in the Q&A, right? Because almost every question that's going to come out of one of those lectures during the Q&A that happens immediately after is going to be driven by the incredible trauma and even anxiety that people are feeling. And it's not actually going to be very deep questions. They're going to be very surface questions looking for quick answers or for immediate relief. And so this is why I actually, when I speak at conferences or when I present, I do my best to stay at least one extra day, because I know that, yes, I'll get some questions in the Q&A immediately after I speak, but the better questions will come 24 hours later, after they've had a few REM cycles, their brain has sort of few through things, and maybe their adrenaline has settled down, and they're thinking a bit differently. And then the next day, I'll get some much better questions coming at me. I've also learned that these are difficult things to press in individual interactions, right? It's very hard to just present this to someone in a conversation where I'm kind of bringing it up out of the blue. I rarely will do that. Instead, this is why I work to have so many resources available online. on my YouTube channel, on my Facebook, is because I find that when people are able to sit down and digest this information privately or with people who they choose to be with, or someone says, hey, here's this video, you should watch it, or this book you should read, and they kind of have a chance to make a decision to watch it or make a decision to read it, and they have a space to do that privately even, that I'm going to have a much better interaction with them talking about it than if I try to bludgeon them over the head with it in a one-on-one interaction. And so I rarely kind of go deep into this stuff in one-on-one interactions with people who aren't already aware of what I do and what I'm talking about. Because again, it's not going to end well. They're gonna be kind of freaked out by what I'm saying, and I'm not going to be able to get very far. And so this is why I have so many resources available. So those are a few of the things that I do, but and I recognize I have to go far beyond. I don't want to just take baby steps, right? I want to rip the Band-Aid off. I want to help people understand, but I also need to recognize that because I'm trying to rip the Band-Aid off, as you will, I'm changing people's paradigms. I'm giving them not just a new way to think about that thing, but a new way to see this entire world they've constructed. And so even if I rip the Band-Aid off, then it's going to take them several weeks, maybe even several months to adjust to this new paradigm I've given them. So again, some of the best conversations I have don't happen immediately after a lecture or even the day after a lecture, even a week after a lecture. Some of the best conversations I have happen 2, 3, 4 months later when I run into someone who's read my book or heard me speak and say, Mr. Charles, I heard you say this. You changed my paradigm. I can't stop thinking about it. I'm now ready to discuss some things, and they'll ask some very more in-depth and kind of probing questions. And those are the conversations that I live for, because those are the conversations that can lead not to immediate individual change, but to long-term systemic change. And that's the kind of change we need. We need long-term systemic change. Right? If I was just out to raise money or to get people to sign a petition, I could do that immediately after one of my lectures, but they're not ready yet to deal with land titles. They're not ready yet to deal with the systemic nature of the land that they're living on, the injustices of the land on the lands they're living on. And so this is where I have to change their paradigm, give them time to adjust to that and become uncomfortable with that, and then offer some options of what we can do to change the system. So I really appreciated that question, and I wanted to share some of that here. But yeah, this is really good. I really appreciate everyone who's joining in on this. And let me see if there's anything else coming through on the chat. But yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. Debbie, I see you're here. Maxine, Yá'át'ééh, Darcy, thanks for joining. Mandel, Harvey, thank you for joining. Phil, thank you so much for your help. Lindsay, thank you for your question. This is fun. I really love doing this kind of thing. And so I'm going to try and do it a bit more regularly, like hopefully once a month. I'll do some Q&A and take questions from people who have been listening to my Second Cups of Coffee or reading my book or doing things, following my content. So if you're interested in staying a part of this conversation, first of all, I want to encourage you to subscribe to me on my YouTube channel. All of my Second Cups of Coffee are archived on my YouTube channel. And if you subscribe to my YouTube channel and get notifications there, you will be able to not only catch me when I do this live, but go back and find these archive videos in a much more efficient way. Right? They're all recorded on Facebook as well, but Facebook is not a good archive medium. And so it's good if you watch me live on Facebook, but to go back and watch something later, that's best to do on YouTube. And so I encourage you to subscribe to me on YouTube. My username on YouTube is Wireless Hogan. Second, if you have heard about my book that I co-authored with my good friend Seung-Chan Ra, and you would like to purchase a signed copy of it, let me give you a link where you can purchase that now. Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. And then third, if you want to support this work I'm trying to do, I have a site on Patreon. And you can join my Patreon. There's several different levels that you can subscribe to. And we do a monthly lecture there. We're actually doing a 12-part series of going through our book. Myself and Sung Chan Ra are doing an online book study on Patreon. We're doing some other Q&As virtually on Patreon. And so there's a lot of ways that you can connect with me on Patreon as well. And I'm going to put that into the comment. So encourage you to join me there if you'd like to. And of course, then that helps even fund some of my work so I can hopefully expand this platform even further beyond where we are right now. But thank you, everybody. This has been a really good time. I appreciate your questions. I appreciate everyone who joins me. If anyone who was there with me on the sunrise this morning, thanks for getting up early and watching me there and joining me for that. And thank you for joining this Q&A. So yeah, my relatives, I hope you have a fantastic Earth Day. I hope this is a day not just about doing something one time today, but making commitments that will change the way you live throughout the rest of the year. And the goal, not only for the environment, but for all of our relationships, is that we can walk in beauty and learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakone.